Hello everyone, please take a seat. My name is Seva and I will be talking about contractual testing or contract testing. So the presentation will be technical and let's introduce ourselves. So who is doing testing, creating some auto tests on API, Postman? Oh, cool, many of you. It's very good. So for you, I think it will be very useful. And maybe not less useful for everyone else. I will give you some links to further materials, and you will be able to look at some videos that span the topic in a broader way. For quite a while, I work with IT. I started as a manual tester, and then I was doing automation, and I was automating backend and mobile apps, UI, and web UI, desktop UI, a lot of stuff. And at some point in time, I think a couple of years ago, I went to live for some time in California and worked for Google for 2 years, and as a developer, then as a lead and as a manager, did a lot of stuff, some strange life, and then I came back to St. Pete and I work as a developer, mostly backend, and I'm also a team lead. I work as a developer in Grid Dynamics and part of program committee in Dizenbach. Cool. So come in 1 month. Sorry for the ads. Right, you know, I am me on Twitter, on Telegram. Any questions, contract testing, whatever questions you have, I will be happy to answer them. So where were we? Who is doing contract testing or heard about contract testing? It's good. Many hands. Last time I was presenting this on a meetup, no one knew, so the progress is there and something is moving. Cool. So for those who don't know about this thing, I will tell you more about how you can do it, which technologies you can use, frameworks, whatever. There's a number of ways on the market, on the framework market, to create contract testing. We will talk about what it is in the beginning. Then I will talk about one of the frameworks, which is Spring Cloud contract. It is a thing that uses Spring. Who heard about Spring? So you know what it is. Good. It is a backend framework that most enterprise developers use. We will talk about usage of Pact for contract testing, and there will be protocol description, and then I will sum it up by discussing how we can live to avoid pain. Do you know this picture? Do you recognize it when you have some API tests or some backend service or a UI that talks to some other backend, sends some request, like give me user Ivan, and it sends back a JSON with some metadata about this user? Yeah, it often happens, like in Postman you do it or somewhere else. Some time passes, you wrote those tests, everything is fine, and you've agreed with the developers that everything's okay, but in days or weeks or months or years, usually it's just, it can be a couple of hours, something strange happens. What exactly? We had this response, and then now we have the new response. Just some developer came, or it was some team's decision, that we would like to change the JSON format that returns data to you because we have a mood for that, or we have some specific business requirements to do so. And it happens that people had were just in a mood and decided to refactor that and said, we will see it in this way. And your tests fail, and what do? You do a face palm, come to the developers and say, like, why have you changed this all? We don't want to change our tests. So first of all, you need to understand whether those changes are valid. Go to analysts, or depending on your process, go to developers and understand why this was implemented. And is it right to do so? And if it's okay, maybe go and fix your tests, run them locally, run them in CI, and check that they pass. And then do the same iteration with the other APIs. And probably it happens for you, right? Yeah, it happens. It seems like it's not very right process. I don't like this picture in some projects I participate. So people come to meetings, they discuss some contracts for hours or days, then they agree. And something changes and you cannot even understand what the flow, or what was the agreement about how you change stuff. So how do you support these things? Whose responsibility is it? Go and find out, you need to fix it, no, you need to fix it. So it's a process that includes a lot of people that need to understand who does what. So in a process where a lot of people are responsible for stuff, it's just a contract. No one is responsible. You need to somehow live with it, and there's an approach called contract testing. There's a consumer, there's a producer, someone who gives the contract, someone who uses the contract. So there are two sides, two people. Like you go to an employer and sign a paper saying you will not be drinking during work hours, for example. So you have that contract, you sign it, you agree with it, and follow it. And there's another approach that says when you come with your own contract, like you are an individual entrepreneur, and you have a contract, and you say, hey, we have a contract. If you're okay with this contract, let's use this as a template. So it's a consumer-driven approach. You, as a consumer who will be providing the services, you give the agreements, propose the agreements to the producer, and producer follows them. So in our case, the producer and the consumer can be different roles and people. It can be UI, microservices, if you have microservice architecture. It can be API tests that you create in that end-to-end packet of millions of tests. And accordingly, a producer-driven contract consists of a number of main steps. The producer defines the contract, the API. He generates the documentation, gives you some examples that you can use, and he can generate some automatic clients, if we talk about the code that will be working with producers, and that's the approach Swagger uses. Do you know Swagger? And did you have a situation where something changes and you have to rewrite all the code? Yeah, it happens. Okay. So accordingly, I've asked you those questions, and let's switch to a consumer-driven contract. We don't want to follow this structure because we would like to define actions, the actions that the producer needs to accomplish. The producer is responsible for them. So we define our expected answers. And you say, I would like to get, for this get user request, for example, the response in this form. And you create tests for those expectations. You create your end tests and unit tests on any side of the story, and you generate the contract. Give it to the producer, and the producer works with your backend developers or other developers to follow that contract. And they take it and they implement it in their REST services, mostly REST services. So this is the approach. And as I said, there are two main frameworks, Spring Cloud Contract and Pact, that most people use. So let's talk about Spring Cloud Contract. The main point is it is generated through Groovy or YAML. Who likes Groovy or YAML? No, me neither. I also don't like them. And it has a packet called verifier, and an important node there is the task of that Spring Cloud contract. And overall contract testing is not to test 100% of the functionality or to create all the load tests and functional tests. It's not a replacement for all your scenarios that you would like to test. It means that in this contract you need to mention all the negative scenarios and mention all the possibilities. It doesn't work. So how do we implement it? There's a lot of steps, more than two, clearly. And for the producer, yes, in the contract that you need to give to a producer, you create a Groovy file or a YAML file in some specific format. It's not that visible here, but it has some syntaxes. And then you add a dependency. If you use Manon, it's this notation. If you use Gradle, then you need to Google it. Then you do clean install, and it runs the plugin that generates tests using this contract on the producer side. And then the producer, on the producer side, will need to implement the functionality that will have to make those tests green, because when you initially generate it, they will all be red because you don't have the functionality, and then when you do have the functionality, then you have tests in green. And you have a contract, you have tests, you have implementation, and on the consumer side, where you usually have API tests or backend service that collaborates with the producer, you can use that contract. How can you use it? You can add a banner, a stub runner that stabs, MUCs, regardless. It will use that contract that you have defined in one place to generate a step for you so that you can test locally. So you don't need to create any binaries like locally. But you can also use that step in a CI service or at some server that will use, like it has a remote mode, for example. You can use remote mode, and that artifact with contracts you can put on some server and use that server as a real server. So instead, if you, for example, have a very complex interaction with a lot of backends working together, usually it happens so in real life, you cannot run them all for 2 or 3 tests and interact with them constantly. So you can use this approach, you can put artifacts with your contracts on some machine and remotely use them to check your tests. To generate the test is not quite a tough job. A very readable test with give and then scenario, and this thing will be generated after you put your expectations into your contract on Groove. The cloud contract supports a lot of frameworks. It's well documented. And if you use Spock or JUnit 5 or some new things like reactive or plugs or rest assured, I don't know, well, something you use definitely out of this list, it supports everything from this list and you can work with it. As I said, you can put that contract as a dependency. So like if your team tests some service and it's used somewhere else, you don't need to write everything, both of your teams don't need to write everything and copy-paste those contracts And just one of you needs to create that contract, put it somewhere, like maybe use artifacts, put it as an artifact. And then all the services, first one, second one, other tests, use that artifact to follow that contract. So you have one source of truth to interact with the services and vice versa. And usually there's a question of like, if you have one service and a lot of different clients, how do you define the structure of how it should look in your code? It's not very clear. If you have one client, you use the tutorial and it works okay, but then if there's some complication, how do you do it? So you put, you define the client 1, client 2, client 3 packages, and you put those groovy files with our expectations by clients there. And if, for example, you have an update of your version of your API and you implement some changes in your API that conflict between themselves, like you decided to change the scheme completely, you can add a new folder saying, hey, client version 2 is here, and you will have a separate file with a version of contract. So with this, you can solve the problem of those ununderstood failures when the code changes. So as soon as the code changes, he will need to fix the test, because on his side, the unit's tests exist that test that service, and they will get a fail and be read when he changes the service. So he needs to change the contract, and he has a dependency that he needs to follow and satisfy. Apart from the way he says, like, oh no, we don't do contract testing anymore because it doesn't give us as much freedom. So the main advantages and pros and cons of the Spring Cloud contract is that it can be a dependency. It can generate tests for you, so you don't need to bother. Can generate stabs. You can use those stabs in UI. It doesn't need to be written on Java. You can just deploy it anywhere. It's just a jar file. It's a Java file that you can put in any place. And the changes lead to test failures on the producer side, because it's good. He will be kept responsible. And there's a lot of examples of documentation. Like if you look at GitHub, for example, it supports the part broker. It's something that we will be talking about a little bit later. But there are disadvantages and cons. For example, we don't know what to do with the UI contract. Like this thing is written on Java, and we don't know how to use it when, for example, you write your test on JavaScript. You will have an issue here. You can use that stab and run it as a jar file. And second thing is it supports only Groovy or YAML, and I don't like either of them. Let's talk about Pact. Pact is translated as contract, at least Oxford dictionaries and Wikipedia say so. So how is it defined? It's defined a little bit differently, in different direction. So if you remember, we said we put the contract into producer and then generate tests, and then now it's a different way. You add those dependencies on the consumer side, then you add a code for your mock, then you create your tests that will accordingly run some REST operations, and then afterwards it will generate a packed file for you that will generate a contract for your tests that you will be able to use. The test itself, you have some DSL that supports that pact and gives you that pact. An important thing here is you can define the path, the method, the status, some body of this method. Like here you have Ivan Petrushkin. And it's a simple mechanism for writing tests. And to run that test, usually you use REST template to make some operations. So here's how the test looks like. In reality, after you run the test, the contract will be generated. It will look like a JSON. An important part here is that the interactions are defined here. In this module, if you remember, we used the get method with user with first last name in base. So 3 slides ago we've defined that method, and it has generated the contract based on this test. But for a producer to implement it all, they have more steps than a consumer. You need to add those dependencies. You need to run something, add something to run it all. A JSON contract that we generated, add test target, and annotations that are needed for that pact, and the tests themselves. So there's many steps for a producer, and you can say there's too much stuff to run all those here contract tests. And maybe it's a valid remark, I don't know. And the question arises, where are those contracts? Like in Spring Cloud contract, I said that this dependency can be put in a factory and used it. We don't know what to do with versioning, where these dependencies should be placed. And in fact, the guys have decided to create a part broker. It's an abstract manager that will do everything for you. So this thing will be doing versioning for you. It will deploy something, some service, CAD or something. I don't know what's being used there. Some service that will use the contract and publish it to you. And it has a lot of features. For example, I just took from the documentation those features, and in those 3 dots there's a lot of options and features it has. Maybe visualizations, those stuff you might not need, but there's a lot of stuff there. So how do you use Pact Broker? You take your pacts, your contracts, those JSON things, you put them somewhere, you take a Docker. Did you listen to the Docker report yesterday? Who uses Docker? Okay, good, cool, thanks. So you take that image, you run it, everything's fine, and you can test your application based or run your tests based on this contract that the broker gave you. The best thing here is that the part broker works, Pact Broker works with Spring Cloud Contract. As you saw, it's quite an independent thing, so you can deploy it in Docker. Accordingly, there's nothing very complex. It can work with Spring Cloud Contract. So if you like Spring approach more, you can just take all the benefits of Pact, but keep using Spring. So this is pretty much it. I hope it's a clear picture on how you should be using this. There's one approach, there's another approach, and how should you use it? Let me repeat myself. Contract testing is not functional testing. It's not performance testing. None of the frameworks, in none of the frameworks do authors say that this should be used for describing your functional or other tests. These things just help you define the interactions of scenarios on how they should happen, how they should not happen. It's like in Swagger. Does it have all the possible scenarios? You have some samples, getting 200 or 404 errors. And it's the same here. You don't need to just write the code for everything else, for all the tests. So to summarize, on Pact, it has, well, not a disadvantage, but nevertheless, you need to be very careful with packed specification. It is something that I did not focus too much on. As you saw, we've created some code to generate packed. We run that code, we wrote that code on Java, and the thing that creates that JSON file from the code is language specific. So we use the plugin that is specific for JVM. There are some plugins that are specific for JavaScript and other scripts. And the minus here is that something can go wrong when you have something written in one language and you use the contract written in another language. It's a great thing that can be used with many different languages. It is quite clear how you should use it. It's written on the UI. It supports Go, it supports Python, JavaScript. So it has support for a lot of languages. And in a front-end world, people use it. Do you have anyone from the front end? Maybe someone in the online just said yes. So, and we have a broker that's well supported. We have GitHub commits with contributors, and the functionality is quite broad here. It's easy to use. You probably saw a couple of steps on how to run Docker with that image, and it solves a lot of questions. Are there any simpler options? So we've configured a lot of stuff, and usually when someone comes and says you need to configure this using those 16 steps, you say like, oh yeah, shit, come on, yeah, maybe I'll do it tomorrow. There's usually a simpler way, right? Yeah, true. There's binary protocol. It's maybe 15 years ago people were playing with that stuff, and there was patch drift and some other binary protocols. One of them is very ancient. Maybe it has new versions. It's called protobuf. So when I worked with Google, they have a lot working with this protocol, and it works quite well. Why? Let me tell you how it looks and what protobuf is. Protobuf is a way to describe your entities. Like you have an entity here that we pass over there, our person Ivan Petrushkin, and this entity can be defined by us in some understood format. We can define it as a JSON or in some other format. So this is that other format. It's called message in their terminology, and it has proto extension. We can define types of fields, their order, whether they are optional or required, how mandatory they are, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's a different format of how you can define the message that you need to send and receive. What next? There's something that converts those messages into a Java class. You can add a plugin. You can run a specific compiler that will generate from the message that you wrote originally with the fields your Java class or JavaScript class or some other class of some other language. And they support, I don't remember exactly, but they do support C, C++, and many other things. So people often use it. And you will have that builder button, like person, new builder, first name, last name. You don't need to write all those things with new person, set, get, and everything. It's very beautiful. and you can use that proto file that you have originally defined in your Java backend. You can use it if, for example, someone came with a UI to you saying, yeah, I would like to use those things. I like the fact that they are already written and I don't need to recreate this all stuff. So this thing can be used in JavaScript, and it will generate those surroundings for that script. If you write something on Python, you can use that message to create classes and fields and set those fields in Python. Or you don't want to understand how to create those JSON structure with big entities. It's quite painful when the entities are big. In C++, you can also use it. So how you implement it? So you take a contract, you put it as a dependency, you run it in Docker somewhere, and in the same way you can put that proto file in the artifactory, put it as a repository, and reuse it as a dependency. If you work on the same code base, define it in a package. If you have a monolithic application, it's fine. In a common package, you can define it. So somewhere, hierarchically, put it higher or lower. Just use it everywhere. Use it in UI, use it in tests, use it in backend tests, microservices, everywhere. And in that case, when, for example, you have that change that we were originally discussing in the beginning of the presentation, saying, I want to change this. You say, yeah, you need to change that message to a different type, Add those fields, add them in the proto file, and as he has changed it, as you have a proto already as a dependency, your CI will automatically run tests that will recreate or rebuild the UI or anything that depends on that proto message as a new build. For example, for this dependency, they don't care because they don't parse it for a microservice. It doesn't matter because they don't use those data. But, for example, you have backend tests that check everything for your coverage, 100%, and they will fail even on the build and compile stage. You will not have to wait for 20 minutes till this compilation runs and your test reaches that point. So within 15-20 seconds you will understand everything's bad there. Or with some other microservice that uses that, you will also get it. In UI tests, it can be the same. But you can say, anyways, you just need to fix it. True, this can be a developer that will go and change stuff, or he will be creating some version that does not spoil everything. But the main advantage here is all those errors are visible during the compilation. So let's go through the summary. So contract testing gives you feedback. You don't need to create a lot of stuff. It makes people who make changes think before they change. You would need to think through how many things you will need to change and maybe think twice about the need to change it. We talk about cloud contracts, and in my links you will be able to get all the details and a lot of videos on how in those workshops how you can do it and can use it with Josh Long workshops, and how to use protobuf as contract. We used it and it was cool. All the links are here. You can just photo it and read that QR code, and you will have the links. They are available. And I have 5 minutes for the questions. And really, I did it to especially. So if someone likes the links in a copy-paste mode, they are also here. Are you fine with the QR code? Thank you very much. So, all the questions. Should we start with Slido? Okay. Why don't you use YAML if you don't like Groovy? Well, YAML I also don't like. There's a hashtag anti-YAML. And there's a conference, DevOps conference, with a lot of people using YAML files and configurators and Kobe. And they all heard a lot because of that. I see someone nodding in the audience, because it's a very tough stuff. If I could, I would write DSL on Kotlin, for example. That would be cool. But I think they don't yet support this stuff. And with Pact, you can just use anything to define it. No questions in Slido. Any questions from the audience? With C#, the first case, no, not possible. Pact, yes. I think it supports C#. Not sure, but you can write it in Python and use them as artifacts. So with Java contract, you have the same interface contract. Can you rewrite the class or create a new class if you change something in the interface? Why would you need to recreate something? Maybe it's stored over there? So this thing is over there, is needed. I understood the question. Yeah, you can redefine all the interfaces and say those interfaces are there. Here's how we interact. But then implement them. Yes. If they are not supported, then yes. But in the interface, you can define the entities for the developer, not for the developer. Can be different positions, different roles. You need to define the structure in the whole application. So this is the question. If you come to me and ask, hey, man, we need to run something that, to create an application that returns a list of something, I say, okay, but tomorrow, the object in that list has changed structure, and for you it's a minor change, something changed, because for me is extremely important, because I've defined the code to be dependent on that structure. So the structures are something that is extremely important for contract testing. So when you change types, when you change contract, yeah, you can, structures can be part of the object, part of whatever. So imagine I've created that structure in a class. Imagine I have tests in one place, backend in another place, created as a separate artifact. And you want to create those classes and put them as a dependency and use that dependency. It's okay. It's a good approach. You'll have the same thing. When you change the model, tests fail the same way that previously. But if those models use the UI, can they use Java models? No, but it wants to use them. So it's a very popular scenario. Not that you have a backend and API, but often you have backend, API, UI, tests, other tests, some other team that writes something for a server. So it's a big, big story. It's a big plus of this thing, because it will give you the stuff. It does not need to create some separate stuff with those contracts. You don't need to recreate the configuration that will rerun your application and redefine all your bins. And I think it was said that it doesn't support UI, right? You can use those tabs as a jar. It will generate it for you for Spring Cloud contracts. It's true. Yeah, you're right. You're correct. But with Pact and Protobuf, a different situation will be. I can use data contract for documenting the changes in API. How can you run the API tests? And how can I write IP tests for them? Was it anyone from the audience? I would just like to understand the question deeper. Okay. Yes. So you want to identify the changes in the integration tests, or you want to use that in the integration tests? So do you want to write tests for the contracts themselves? Yeah, you can do it. But the contract will generate the tests for you. So it will generate the tests for the data and structure integrity. You define the contract, and the tests are generated automatically. So here's how it changes. You say, yeah, we need to redefine because those tests fail, and you need to fix them. In fact, you write those tests. In the first case, you define the contract, and in the second case, you change the scenarios of testing and generates the contract for you. Is there an option? No, there's no option like this. Yeah, true, correct. So it can be some copy-paste work. Yeah. But as I said, it shouldn't be done in a way like you have millions of that stuff. It's usually not that many of them. Thank you for the question. Thank you.